Hello. I never expected my quiet, uneventful life to change so drastically. One moment I was sipping my morning coffee, staring at the empty chair across from me, and the next, I was caught in the most dangerous, electrifying connection of my life. I did not see it coming. Not at my age. Not with her. Rachel, my stepdaughter, was the last person I expected to hear from after years of silence. We were practically strangers, our paths rarely crossing even when her mother was alive. But that phone call, her voice soft, hesitant, pulled me into something I could not walk away from. "Hey, Tom, I need a favor." Her words were simple, but they hit me with a strange intensity. I had not heard from her in months, maybe even a year. So, when she called, I knew something was up. Rachel, at 24, was smart, independent, and determined, a force of nature. She had just graduated and was trying to make her way in the world, but now she was struggling. Rent was high, jobs were scarce, and life had thrown her some unexpected curveballs. "Sure, Rachel," I said, trying to sound casual, but I could feel the weight of what was coming next. "I need a place to stay, just for a little while, until I get back on my feet." My house had been empty for so long. The idea of having someone else around, especially someone so young and full of life, was strange. But how could I say no? "Of course. You're welcome to stay as long as you need," I told her, not realizing how much those words would change everything. I spent the next couple of days preparing the guest room, cleaning up the house, and wondering what it would be like to have someone living with me again. I was nervous, though I could not figure out why. I had not shared my space with anyone in years, let alone someone as vibrant as Rachel. There was a strange energy building inside me, something unfamiliar, unsettling. The day she arrived, I watched her pull up in an old, beat-up car. As she stepped out, I barely recognized her. She had grown into a confident, beautiful woman, tall, slim, with long dark hair that fell in waves around her shoulders. Her green eyes sparkled as she smiled at me, but there was something different about her. She was not the awkward teenager I had met at family barbecues years ago. Rachel had grown into something else, something I could not ignore. "Hey, Tom," she said with that same soft, hesitant tone. It felt almost intimate. "Hey, Rachel." "Welcome," I replied, feeling an odd flutter in my chest as she hugged me. Her body pressed against mine for just a moment, but it was enough to stir something deep inside me. We settled into a routine, at least for the first few days. She spent most of her time in her room or out looking for jobs. I tried to keep my distance, not wanting to be overbearing. But there was something different about the house now. It felt more alive with her in it. I noticed small things, like how she would smile at me across the kitchen, or how her hand would linger just a second too long when she handed me a coffee mug. There was a warmth in the way she looked at me, something that made me feel alive in a way I had not felt in years. It was subtle at first. Little glances, brief touches, small moments of conversation that felt like they held more meaning than they should have. I tried to brush it off, telling myself I was imagining things. But as the days went on, the tension between us grew, simmering beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to boil over. One night, just a couple of weeks after she moved in, that moment came. It was late, well past midnight, and the house was quiet. I had gone to bed early, but I could not sleep. My mind was racing, thoughts of Rachel slipping into places they should not have. I lay there in the dark, trying to calm my breathing, when I heard the soft creak of my bedroom door opening. At first, I thought I was dreaming, but then I saw her, Rachel, standing in the doorway, silhouetted by the dim light from the hallway. "Rachel?" I whispered, my voice hoarse with confusion. "Is everything okay?" She stepped into the room, closing the door behind her. My heart started pounding as she walked toward me, her face unreadable in the shadows. She looked vulnerable, almost lost. I could not sleep," she said quietly, sitting on the edge of my bed. The mattress dipped under her weight, and I felt her presence so acutely it made my chest tighten. I sat up, rubbing my eyes, trying to shake off the haze of sleep. "What's wrong?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She hesitated for a moment, then turned to me, her eyes locking onto mine. "I don't know. I just Feel like everything's falling apart." Her words tugged at something inside me. I had always seen Rachel as strong, independent, someone who could handle anything. But in that moment, she seemed so fragile, so real. Without thinking, I reached out and placed my hand on her arm, offering her the only comfort I could. "You're going to be fine," I said softly, trying to reassure her. "It's just a rough patch. You'll get through it." Her gaze flickered, and for a moment, the air between us changed. It felt thick, charged with something I had not felt in years. I should have pulled away, should have set a boundary right then and there. But instead, I stayed where I was, my hand still on her arm. "Thanks, Tom," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. I nodded, not trusting myself to say anything else. She stood up slowly, her eyes lingering on me for a second longer than necessary, before she turned and walked back to her room. As the door clicked shut behind her, I lay back down, my heart racing. I did not know what to make of the moment we had just shared. Was it just my imagination? Or had something shifted between us? The next morning, things seemed normal, at least on the surface. Rachel was already up by the time I came downstairs, sipping coffee and scrolling through job listings on her laptop. She greeted me with a smile, and for a moment, I wondered if the night before had been some strange dream. But then I caught the way her eyes lingered on mine, just a fraction too long, and I knew. Something had changed between us, even if neither of us was ready to admit it. We fell into a rhythm over the next few days. We made small talk over breakfast, laughed at the same shows on TV, and, for the most part, kept a safe distance from whatever was brewing beneath the surface. But the tension was there, building slowly, like a storm waiting to break. It was a Thursday night when things finally came to a head. Rachel had gone out for an interview earlier that day, and when she came home, her mood was different, lighter, more confident. I had been sitting in the living room, flipping through channels, when she walked in with a grin on her face. "I think it went well," she said, dropping her bag by the door. "They seemed interested. I should know by the end of the week." "That's great," I replied, genuinely happy for her. It had been tough watching her struggle, and the thought of her landing a job was a relief. We decided to celebrate, ordering takeout and cracking open a bottle of wine. The conversation was easy, flowing naturally from one topic to the next. We talked about her job prospects, her plans for the future, and even reminisced about some of the old family gatherings we had both attended, back when things were simpler. But as the night wore on, the wine started to loosen our tongues, and the conversation shifted. We both knew it was coming, but neither of us was brave enough to bring it up until the moment was right. "I haven't stopped thinking about that night," Rachel said suddenly, her voice low, almost hesitant. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. I knew exactly what night she was talking about, and I could feel the tension in the room thickening as the words hung between us. "Me neither," I admitted quietly, my pulse quickening. I had been trying to push it out of my mind, telling myself that I was reading too much into it, but there was no denying it now. Something had shifted between us, and it was impossible to ignore. Rachel looked down at her glass, swirling the wine around as if gathering the courage to say what was on her mind. "I don't know what to do with this," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "With us." The room fell silent, and I could feel the weight of her words pressing down on me. It was wrong. Everything about this was wrong. But the pull I felt toward her, the connection we had, was undeniable. I had been fighting it for weeks, but now, sitting here with her, the distance between us disappearing, I did not know if I could fight it anymore. I reached across the table and took her hand, feeling the warmth of her skin against mine. "Rachel," I began, my voice shaky, "I don't know what this is either, but I know I can't stop thinking about you." Her eyes met mine, and in that moment, I could see the conflict mirrored in her expression. She squeezed my hand, her grip firm, and I could feel the heat between us intensify. "I don't want to mess this up," she said, her voice trembling, "but I don't want to ignore it either." Neither did I. Without thinking, I stood up, walking around the table to where she was sitting. She looked up at me, her eyes wide and full of uncertainty, but there was something else there too, something that made my heart race. I reached out, pulling her gently to her feet, and for a moment, we just stood there, inches apart, the air between us charged with electricity. And then, without warning, I kissed her. It was soft at first, hesitant, like we were both testing the waters. But as soon as her lips pressed against mine, everything else melted away. The doubts, the fear, the guilt. All that mattered was her, and the way she made me feel. Alive. Wanted. Like the years of loneliness and loss had finally lifted, and I could breathe again. She kissed me back, her hands sliding up to cup my face as she leaned into me, and I could feel the heat between us grow. My hands moved to her waist, pulling her closer, and the intensity of the moment hit me like a wave. It was wrong. It was forbidden. But it was also inevitable. When we finally pulled apart, we were both breathless, our foreheads resting against each other as we stood there, wrapped in the silence of the moment. Neither of us spoke for a long time, the weight of what we had just done settling in. "What now?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my racing heart. "I do not know," I admitted honestly, "but I know I do not want to stop." Rachel smiled softly, her fingers tracing the line of my jaw. "Me neither." We stayed like that for what felt like hours, just holding each other, the unspoken understanding between us solidifying. The kiss had changed everything, and we both knew there was no going back now. That night, we did not talk about what had happened. We both went to bed, pretending that everything was the same as before. But it was not. The energy between us had shifted, and there was no denying the pull we felt toward each other. The following days were filled with an undeniable tension between us. We still danced around each other, avoiding any direct acknowledgement of what had happened, but every touch, every glance, told a different story. I would catch her eyes lingering on me, her lips parting as if she wanted to say something, but thought better of it. My hand would brush against hers as we passed in the hallway, sending sparks through my body, and I knew she felt it too. We were in uncharted territory, and neither of us knew how to navigate it. But the truth was, we were both too far gone to turn back. One evening, a few days after the kiss, Rachel came home from another interview, looking worn out. She kicked off her shoes and collapsed onto the couch next to me with a heavy sigh. "Long day?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady as the familiar pull between us made the air feel heavy. "Yeah," she murmured, resting her head back and closing her eyes. "I don't know how much more of this I can take." I wanted to comfort her, to tell her everything would be okay, but instead, I sat there in silence, watching her. The way her hair fell across her shoulders, the soft rise and fall of her chest as she breathed, it was intoxicating. I could feel the tension building again, the same tension that had been simmering between us since that kiss. Before I realized what I was doing, I reached out and took her hand. Her eyes fluttered open, and she looked at me, her expression unreadable. But there was no mistaking the way her body reacted to my touch, the way her breath hitched as my thumb brushed across her knuckles. "Tom," she whispered, her voice soft, almost pleading. I did not say anything. Instead, I leaned in, closing the distance between us. Our lips met again, and this time, there was no hesitation, no holding back. The kiss was deeper, more urgent, fueled by all the emotions we had been bottling up for so long. Rachel's hands tangled in my hair as she pressed herself closer to me, her body warm against mine. I pulled her onto my lap, my hands sliding down to her hips as we kissed, the intensity growing with every passing second. It was electric, intoxicating, and completely consuming. We did not stop this time. We could not. The desire between us had reached a breaking point, and there was no turning back now. Later that night, as we lay tangled together in the dim light of the living room, the weight of what we had done began to sink in. I could feel her heart beating against my chest, her breath warm on my skin, and for a moment, everything felt perfect. But the reality of the situation was impossible to ignore. This is crazy," I whispered, my voice barely audible in the quiet room. Rachel shifted beside me, propping herself up on one elbow to look at me. Her eyes were soft, full of something I could not quite name. "I know," she admitted, "but I do not regret it." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. I did not regret it either, but that did not make it any less complicated. What we were doing was wrong, There was no denying that. The age difference, the fact that I had been married to her mother, the weight of it all pressed down on me, making it hard to breathe. But what happens now? I asked, my voice tight with uncertainty. Where do we go from here? Rachel looked at me for a long moment, her expression thoughtful. I do not know, she finally said, but I do not want to stop. Not now. Her honesty floored me, and for a moment, I was speechless. Part of me wanted to pull away, to tell her that this was a mistake, that we needed to stop before things got any more complicated. But another part of me, the part that had been buried under years of grief and loneliness, wanted to hold on to her, to this moment, and never let go. We will take it one day at a time, I said finally, my voice quiet but steady. We will figure it out. Rachel nodded, her fingers tracing lazy patterns on my chest as we lay there in silence. Neither of us had the answers, but for the first time in a long time, I felt hopeful. Like maybe, just maybe, there was a future here. Something worth holding on to. Over the next few weeks, we settled into a new kind of rhythm. The tension between us was still there, but it had shifted into something more comfortable. We talked more about everything and nothing at all. We touched more, too. Small, intimate gestures that said more than words ever could. But we never spoke about the future. Not really. We both knew this could not last forever, but neither of us was ready to face that truth just yet. For now, we were content to live in the moment, to take what we could from each other and pretend that the outside world did not exist. One evening, after Rachel had landed her first official job, we decided to celebrate again. We ordered takeout, opened another bottle of wine, and sat on the couch, talking and laughing like we had done a dozen times before. But as the night wore on, the conversation took a more serious turn. I do not know what I would have done without you, Rachel said, her voice soft as she looked at me with those big green eyes of hers. You have been there for me in ways I never expected. Her words tugged at something deep inside me, and for a moment, I could not find the right words to respond. I had always thought of myself as someone who had nothing left to offer, but Rachel had changed that. She had made me feel alive again, in ways I never thought possible. I think you have done more for me than you realize, I said finally, my voice rough with emotion. You brought me back to life. The room fell silent, and for a moment, we just sat there, looking at each other. The weight of everything we had shared, everything we had been through, hung heavy in the air between us. And then, without saying a word, she leaned in and kissed me. It was not the desperate, urgent kiss from before. It was something softer, more intimate. A promise, maybe, or an understanding that, no matter what happened next, we had this moment. As we pulled apart, I rested my forehead against hers, my breath mingling with hers in the quiet of the room. We will figure this out, I whispered, more to myself than to her. And maybe, just maybe, we would. Bye.